I'm happy to hand the mic over to Roger Tang. He's the Senior Vice President of Science Systems and Engineering at TripleRing Technologies. Take it away.
Hopefully everyone can hear me. Well, thank you for inviting us to present around a topic near and dear to us at TripleRing, solving hard problems to develop breakthrough products. And just to let you know, we're going to break this session up into two distinct parts. Part one I call theory or philosophy behind solving hard problems to develop products. And then in the second part of the session, we have a panel of folks here that I'll introduce later that will speak to sort of the practical aspects of that. Without further ado, just a question of who am I? Actually, my responsibility at TripleRing is to make sure we have the right resources, technical resources to address all of our projects for our various partners. I have a background in bioengineering. I know a little physics. I know a little optics and other stuff like that. In terms of TripleRing, in case you haven't ever heard of us, what we do, we essentially stand alongside our clients and partners to solve hard problems, to develop breakthrough products, and to create new companies. That's, in one sentence, what we do. We typically work on complex systems, complicated systems at the intersection of life sciences and technology. And we invest in our own work. We're not just a company that you pay for services. We're actually a partner, co-development partner. We like to put our skin in the game, as they say. We like to potentially sometimes co-invest with some of our partner companies. So let's get on with the didactic part of this. Part one, we call this theory or the philosophy. So I'm going to start with a picture. I think most of us recognize this. I think most of us, when we first start out as engineers or product development people, we think of the traditional product development model. And often it's referred to as a phase gate development process. In that process, there's design, build, and test. And we all recognize the linear elements of this process. And of course, we all know that often what happens is the difficult technical and non-technical work gets done in the design test phase of this process. But alluding to what Bryce Rudder said before and to what other speakers I think will be speaking to later in this conference, really, what inevitably happens is that there's a loop back. For some reason you missed something. There's something that you did wrong. There's something around the user experience, whatever. But there's an inevitable design loop back. In real life, we know actually it can be a lot worse than that. We know that there are times when, unfortunately, the user discovers the problems, and those loopbacks become very, very expensive. So what's the paradigm shift in your head? What's the paradigm shift that we take to sort of think about the problem differently? And it's to really think about analyze and test before design. So where the difficult work, technical and non-technical, get done really in an iterative fashion. You see sort of here the way we think of it. For those of you who think about lean and agile and those kinds of things, a way of thinking about that front end is around a plan, do, check, act cycle. We here at TripleRing, we call it a systems science model, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. What we focus on very early on is closing key knowledge gaps. And closing key knowledge gaps is tackling that fuzzy front end. And we've talked a little bit this morning around the user needs, the user experience, human factors, ergonomics. That's a key knowledge gap at the front and the fuzzy front end. We talk about actors and roles. Who are the users? How do they use the potential product? How do they use the product? How does that product used in the workflow of those folks' roles? What's the journey of the product through the process of its life? How is it developed? How is it manufactured? How is it sterilized? Who touches it? And when. All those things are part of that fuzzy front end. I know there's at least a couple of presentations today that speak to that. There's also the fuzzy front end, which we call systems science. There's cutting edge technologies. There's sometimes uncertain biology or physiology. And even unstable chemistry is part of that, the science, the fuzzy front end. So I've given you sort of a philosophy, a theory, but I love to give a concrete example. And my favorite example, of course, doesn't come from the medical device world, but comes from a world that all of us understand. The famous example I'm going to talk about is the Wright Brothers. And if you think about it, the Wright Brothers conquered manned, controlled, heavier-than-air powered flight at the beginning of the 20th century, And basically, a lot of people failed. They did it in Dayton, Ohio, in the early, between 1899 and 1903. They did it part-time. They had a day job. They were bicycle repair and sales folks. They ran a bicycle shop in Dayton. And they were educated to the point of high school. They never went to college. So the question you should ask yourself, and we all ask ourselves, is how did the Wright brothers pull this off when others were both more educated and better funded? And of course, we all know the answer. They did analyze and test before design. So let's think about what they did and use that as a lesson for us. Before designing their first airplane, they began with a knowledge search. They did their homework. And it could be a homework for any different product. You can decide on what kind of homework that is. In their particular case, of course, they knew nothing about flight. They requested the available information from the Smithsonian at the time in 1899. They studied the lift tables from Otto Lilienthal. How do you get things off the ground? What's the theory behind flight? They were corresponded with Octave Chanute, a railroad engineer and leading aviation expert at the time. They did their homework. And the key to this is identifying the key knowledge gaps before designing the first airplane. It could be user knowledge gap, it could be human factors knowledge gap. In their case, they decided the 3 knowledge gaps were lift, propulsion, and control. How do you get an airplane off the ground? Once it's off the ground, how do you control it? How do you do that? And of course, to get it off the ground, what kind of propulsion do you need? What's the engine? What's the propeller? What are those things? And what do they do? Before designing their first airplane, they essentially identified and closed those key knowledge gaps. They did it by performing analysis and ultimately doing experiments. Experiments on subsystems, experiments on breadboard systems of the full airplane. They did wind tunnel testing, which is amazing. I invite you, if you haven't been to the Smithsonian on the Mall in Washington, D.C., to see the actual Wright Brothers flyer. It's a fascinating study in the application of the scientific method in engineering. And one of my favorite quotes from Wilbur Wright, it's the non-glamorous lab work that's absolutely essential, critical to the success of a project. And of course, we all know what happened. On December 17, 1903, the first flight of the Wright Brothers flyer. But what's less known is on December 15th, 2 days before the first flight, a telegram was sent from the Wright brothers to their father with the phrase, "Success assured, keep quiet." And of course, we know they were confident because they'd done their homework. So what are the lessons we take from the Wright brothers? I use this every time. Every time I think about developing anything, what's the lessons from the Wright brothers? Number one, understand existing knowledge. Do your homework. Divide your challenge into logical subsystems. Importantly, identify the key knowledge gaps. What do we need to know that we don't know now? It doesn't matter if we don't do anything, we have to close those key knowledge gaps because there is no product otherwise. And those knowledge gaps can be financial, user-focused, human factors-focused, or technical. Perform the analyses or experiments on the components, on the breadboards, on the whatever subsystems or systems you need to do before you actually build the final product. In their case, to build a full airplane. Just a few comments and some examples of some work we've done recently. On the upper left here, we have a foot system to looking at diabetic foot ulcers, where we're using a camera and an unusual way of interrogating the feet. In the center there, we have a marijuana breathalyzer. It's a platform system to detect analytes in breath. We'll speak a little bit more about that later. In the upper right here, we have a wearable that we put on a patient to monitor a fluorophore in the body that's tracing kidney function. On the lower left here, we have what we call an electronic brachytherapy system, where we develop an exotic X-ray source to deliver energy in their surgical suite. We have a system for measuring nitric oxide in breath. We have a system here that, hopefully this laser pointer works, over here that measures oxygen in the skin layers and tissue layers, and only the tissue layers, not systemically, but looking at skin grafts and how they heal post-graft. On the bottom right, we have an interesting one. We have electrostimulation suit, and that's sort of the phone interface to it. for basically stimulating muscle during exercise, for enhancing exercise. So here's some examples. So that ends the didactic portion. Hopefully you get a picture of the theory of how we do things, the philosophy. But right now I'd like to introduce the panel that's sitting to my left here, to your right. I'd like to have them each maybe introduce themselves, and then we'll take questions from the audience around the sort of the practical application of what I've just talked about. Maybe Ed or Brian?
We're in the wrong order, I see. I'm Brian. I'm in the middle, except not. I have my training is in physics, and out of school, I went to work in the field of nuclear magnetic resonance imaging, and this is so long ago that they still used the nuclear word. They deleted that and called it MRI afterwards. I realized just now that CAT scanners used to be called CAT scanners, and they realized that was a little too frivolous, so they renamed it CT. So there's a lot to be said for the name. Anyway, I've been in complicated medical gadgetry most of the intervening many decades, and TripleRing in part, and Roger mentioned I'm one of the co-founders. TripleRing in part was sort of a venture based on the notion that we had worked in this complicated space of machines with thousands of parts for quite a while, and we felt we understood some of that. And Roger just spoke about how we've tended to organize our thinking in that area. Right now, I do mostly helping people out. I realize my job is roughly analogous to the fact that I'm a grandfather, which is my job is to not get mad and to say it'll be okay, and that's always true, in fact.
Good morning. I'm Ed Solomon. I'm also one of the co-founders of TripleRing. My background is in electrical engineering, systems engineering, and biomedical engineering. I have over 30 years of experience in developing medical products. Mostly what I do at TripleRing at this point is directed to systems engineering. My career also took a bit of a detour. I went to business school and spent 6 years in the venture capital business, and that was before I saw the light and returned to the real world of hands-on medical product device development. But that background in the venture community was also very valuable, because as we think about some of our clients and how they lay out their development plans, you always want to make sure that you're on the path to meeting major milestones that will assure those companies of continued financing.
And I'm Jeff Stoll. I'm at a company, a client, we work with TripleRing on our product, which we'll tell a little bit more about, a company called HoundLabs. I'm the VP of Innovation. My background, I'm actually trained in engineering, and oddly enough with this conference, surgical robotics, but here I am actually in the diagnostics world. But the company that I'm with right now, HoundLabs, we build the breathalyzer for marijuana. We're basically a breath diagnostics company, and there's tons of things in breath, but with the current climate, detecting a means to tell if somebody recently smoked or ate marijuana is really critical to the safety of our roads and safety of our workplaces. So the company was founded in 2014. Our founder, a guy named Dr. Mike Lynn, he's not only an ER physician, but also a sheriff. So he sees both sides of this issue and really is very passionately driven this sort of a product. We've developed, along with TripleRing, for a number of years, and we've gotten to a place where we're now in manufacturing, and we're hopefully to be commercial very, very shortly. We've taken this out with law enforcement. In fact, that was me. We've done a fantastic ride along, and actually have demonstrated this product in the real world and gotten fantastic feedback. So just a quick look at what it is. Underneath this nicely packaged exterior, there is a huge number of problems that were solved. But basically, what you have is a breath collection device. We call it the handheld. That facilitates collection of your breath sample into a disposable breath cartridge. This cartridge is a self-contained, single-use cartridge, as many diagnostics are. Once you have collected a sample of breath, it takes about 2 minutes. You put that cartridge into the base station where it processes it and gives you your reading as to whether or not you took marijuana sometime in the last 3 hours. 3 hours being important because that's the period of time when marijuana is significantly impairing. Organizations like NHTSA, researchers for the past 30 years have identified this 3-hour window as your window of impairment, and that's really what we're trying to detect with this device.
So in this part of the presentation, I think what we're going to do is essentially invite the audience to ask questions, but I have a couple of questions I want to start out with just to get the flow going here. One of the questions that people often ask me, and I should ask the two founders of TripleRing, can you tell us a little bit about how TripleRing got started and maybe why the name TripleRing Technologies?
So I'll take a crack at that. And as there are many founders, there are so many different stories about the name and exactly what it means. So I'll give you my version. The founders all worked together at a company where we were developing a very innovative but highly complex X-ray fluoroscopy system for interventional cardiology. And as part of that effort together, we developed an enormous, so first of all, there were many systems that had to work together. And I think that ties back to what Roger was saying about making sure that each of the systems work together before you try and integrate them into a larger system. The other thing that we developed along the way was because the project was so much broader than any one of us individuals, we developed an enormous amount of mutual trust and respect. And so the TripleRing name and its associated Venn diagram really tries to encapture this idea of many subsystems that have to work together in order for the product as a whole to work. And equally importantly, it's the interpersonal relationships and linkages, this mutual respect, along with deep technical ability, which remains some of the core values of TripleRing.
That's actually quite a very good summary of things. I'll give just a few additional comments. Ed spoke about mutual respect. I think one of the things that's true in the Silicon Valley, I don't know about the rest of the country, I've only ever lived here actually, so, is that people have lots of jobs. I've had 15 jobs in my career, which normally looks like a flaky resume, but around here it's sort of normal. And what happened, the good news about that actually is, even though the companies you've never heard of, the fact is you collect this long list of people that you've worked with in the past that are just brilliant folks, and you'd trust them at any point in the future. And I think what Ed spoke about in that regard, that respect is derived from that sort of suffering in concert on hard problems. I would say that the other, from my point of view, certainly, and being trained on the science side, frankly, rather than the engineering side, one way to distinguish scientists from engineers is that engineers are supposed to be right, and scientists are almost always wrong. They're almost always wrong. So anyway, on speaking from that point of view, I would say one of the features of these complicated apparatus are that you put them together and you turn them on, and notwithstanding all the work, the thinking, the agonizing, the vast amount of testing that you might have already done, you put them together, and what you get for an answer, does it work or not, is not even sensible. It's not even a yes, no. It's something strange. And the part of the origin of the term system science is that you can treat that problem like a mystery of nature. It's not. There's no new physics going on here, but it's confusing. And so you can approach that confusion in a scientific way. And so one of the things that we actually look for in our people is the ability to be confused for long periods of time and still think of something to try each day. Because actually the only way to truly fail is that if you decide today that I'm just going to give up. And other than that, if you keep thinking of things and keep arguing with one another and arm wrestling about what to be done next, eventually something will start to make sense, and you'll be able to build upon that.
Yeah, thanks. Actually, speaking of challenging, complex, and difficult problems, maybe, Jeff, maybe if you can, I don't know if you're allowed to, if you're allowed to talk about maybe some of the complexities and challenges that were part of the development of a marijuana breathalyzer, and sort of what your thoughts were on how we as partners were able to overcome some of those challenges.
Sure. Well, we'll see if this microphone works as well. Okay. Yes. So, Brian, what you were saying about being confused for a long period of time, that I very much, I lived through that, and I really do agree that that's what makes a quality team member. So, I mean, breath in marijuana, I mean, just going back to some of the things that have already been said, there was research that was already done. We knew some things, but nobody ever built something like this before. And so the first question that you had to be confused about for quite a long time is how much marijuana is actually in somebody's breath. So if we say marijuana, we're just talking about the chemical THC. How much THC is in somebody's breath? We sort of had an idea, but really that was the first very, very hard problem, was actually building something that could detect something that we didn't know what the level of detection had to be. So you would test first time, nothing would show up. So then you redesign, you test again, you do 3 different forms to try and understand that. You get some interesting things elsewhere, and you keep going down and down and down and down. That took, I would say, at least a year to really get down to a point where we were confidently detecting a consistent amount of THC in the breath in a way that was viable for a product. And then, all of a sudden one day, we started getting confident, going out and doing some tests, and we got this opportunity to do a road test up at a racetrack up in the North Bay. We went out there, tested some people, had them drive around, and took all the data back, and there was nothing. Like the THC had completely disappeared, and so all of our confidence went right out the window. And this was the first truly hard problem that we addressed. So then we had to spend a couple of months figuring out where the heck it went. Long story short, with lots of experiments later, we discovered that if you breathe fresh air after smoking a joint, your breath levels are actually a factor of 100 lower than they are if you smoke inside. So there was a lot of, so all of a sudden we had solved all these problems, and the next problem was, all right, we'll make it 100 times more sensitive. And so, this was, it's a process like this, and this notion of design science, you're always doing this early testing. If we had built this product out, it would have failed right away had we not known this key detail but nobody else knew about marijuana and breath. So that's the key example. Do you want me to keep going on?
No, that's a great example. I guess maybe could you reflect, I know you've worked with other development partners over your career. Can you reflect on maybe some of the essential differences you're seeing in terms of the TripleRing approach in terms of solving hard problems and with others?
Yeah, so we have, at Hound, we don't tell you guys this, but we have a lot of conversations about, is the talent we have creative enough, right? We're dealing with the hairy edge of science in some ways and trying to build a groundbreaking product around this. The real question is, are the engineers on your team thinking beyond the problem enough that you're going to really get the answer you need? And really, in my mind, that's what sets TripleRing apart. That's why I love working with TripleRing, is that the level of creativity is always there. These guys are always thinking ahead of the problem, and in a way that's really, you're sure you're going to get the right answer. It's not like they have a toolbox that they're trying to apply. In fact, most of it is scientific investigation, which is, to me, tremendously interesting, but also a very good way to get the right answer.
Yeah, we think about that as sort of the rigorous application of the scientific method to engineering problems, really, and that's sort of the basis of the philosophy. Again, the audience can ask. Feel free to ask questions. Oh, maybe.
Thank you all so much. My question is looking at a company like yours, HoundLabs. So how did the relationship start with it? An application process to get picked up by TripleRing, So how did that relationship start, and how much collaboration did you have with them along the journey?
Yeah, just to repeat the question for the rest of the audience, how did you get started with TripleRing, and how much collaboration did we have as development partners working with you throughout the journey?
Yeah, so the starting of the journey with TripleRing, we had a basic detector, actually came out of the university, and we wanted to commercialize it. We thought this was great, we've got it, this just need to package it and off we go. Brought it to TripleRing, started to build something up around it, and quickly learned how insufficient it was. wasn't sensitive enough, et cetera, and then the journey began. And really, your question about how is the collaboration, that's really, we treat TripleRing, they actually are now investors, but we treat them like part of the team. Like literally, TripleRing is in our meetings. We file IP with them. There's all sorts of, it's very, very deep collaboration in terms of what we do. It's not just product development or research. It's, kind of where's our roadmap going and how we can leverage what we've learned.
Another question.
Ed and Brian, how do you know when you're going to invest in one of your client companies? What percentage of them do you invest in? And what do you see in those companies that you do invest in?
The question, and just to repeat for the audience, how do you choose who to invest in, and
What percentage of,
and what percentage of the clients do we invest in?
invested in, and how do you make the decision to invest?
And how do we make that decision?
Yeah, let me address that because this is a relatively recent transition at TripleRing. I would say for the early part of the company's life, the company is 17 years old now. It was mostly a straight fee-for-service arrangement. We frankly didn't have any capital. We bootstrapped the entire operation, and so pay-as-you-go was the norm. As the company has grown and we do have greater resources, both financial and also in terms of personnel that we're willing to commit to these projects, we are willing to share in some of that risk. I think I don't think there's a very clear set of guidelines. I come from part of my background was on investments, and I see the value of a portfolio. And so we want to do this quite widely across the board, but to a modest level that we can share in the success of our companies, but without risking the enterprise as a whole. I understand that's not a very complete answer to your question, but we are figuring it out as we go along.
I'll add an observation, which is that in many ways, TripleRing has started to, if you think of all the risks that particularly a startup faces, there's everything from financing risk, you've got to get some money from somebody, there's building a team, there's identifying products, there's developing things, regulatory, and most of our work is in healthcare, certainly, so regulatory is always an issue, marketing. There's just vast numbers of risks. And in many ways, TripleRing was started really to capture and deal with one of those, which is the technical development aspect of it. And so the nominal statement is that we are relatively narrow in our focus compared to all the risks that a company faces. But I would say and that doesn't make for a very wise investment decision-making process. I'll just acknowledge that because I'm sort of the poster child for unwise investment development. Anyway, but the fact is that we've all, as we said before, we've all worked for a variety of companies, and many of the companies, in fact, all the companies I've ever worked for have been small, less than 100 people typically. And you're never far from any problem in a company that size. You hear all the shouting matches behind closed doors. You know all about the financing issues and the market-related issues and regulatory. So I would say that one of our sort of extra little things that comes along for the ride, in addition to the technical aspect, is just at least the familiarity with the broad spectrum of problems that a company faces as they're trying to get into the marketplace. And so, in some sense, and Ed comes to this with actual domain knowledge, so he's in a position to be much more categorical in his assessments. But even for me, I've seen some of these problems before, and so I know to look out for some of these things. And that affects how we actually do our work apart from the investment, because it's not our job just to do the one thing. We have to integrate with all of the other efforts that the company is coping with at that point in time.
Following up on that thread, actually, I get asked this question a lot, and I'll ask you, since this is my opportunity to ask you guys questions. Does TripleRing only really work for startups, or does TripleRing work with non-startups? And how do we deal with those kinds of engagements?
So the short answer is yes, we work with large companies as well. Many of us come from the venture and entrepreneurial side, and so that we have a natural affiliation. But yes, we work for large companies as well, and you'd be surprised, the problems are exactly the same. We often are brought in to work on a problem on a product that is perhaps now 20 years old. That product was acquired as part of an acquisition. The original team is somewhere out in the wind, and the documentation from 20 years ago is slim, to say the least. And so we often find ourselves in the process of trying to figure out what are the requirements for this product? What is its theory of operation? We might have build information and schematics and software, but some of the underlying thinking is no longer there. And so some of those efforts are, in fact, no different than a small company. What are we going to do? Why? I mean, in this case, it's why did they do it that way? It seems to sort of work, but are we allowed to make this change? Will we break something that we didn't know about? So you'd like to think that big companies have their act together. Maybe that's true, but the things that find their way to TripleRing would say otherwise. But those problems are no less technically challenging, no less technically satisfying. They often have very large multiples. These might be hundreds of millions of dollar products that are on market, and you have the ability to either save that product, develop the next generation of it. And so the leverage, the financial leverage on those projects is actually very exciting.
Again, similar note, I've been not just at small companies, but earlier in my career, I worked at Siemens, which is 500,000 people worldwide. Siemens has a great organization inside called Siemens Corporate Research, and I worked a lot with them. It's basically a group of PhDs that if you need the resources for a project, you can go and contract the right PhD you need without having to maintain an expert in whatever on your payroll that you may not need for every project. I see a lot of similarities in terms of the multiplier effect that TripleRing brings in that regard, right? You don't have to be the size of a Siemens in order to have that ability to bring in the talent that you need for a given project. And I think that's where really it crosses over from big companies to small companies.
Maybe you can speak to the kind of talent or the kind of people at TripleRing. What, in your, from a partner perspective, what are your thoughts in terms of the kinds of people, maybe the skill sets of the people, and sort of what they bring to the table at TripleRing that maybe we don't even understand?
Well, so walking around TripleRing, I've been embedded there for the last 2 years, so I got to know a lot of people. You can go over. There's of course designers there, but there's PhD levels in optics, guys who have been in the world for a long time. They've got wet labs, people who can do molecular science, and so. Oftentimes when you're doing innovation, it's a matter of combining different disciplines that may not have, known to talk to each other, or hadn't had that opportunity. And that's really the advantage of a wide range of talents. Is if you can maintain that, you have this ability to bring these disciplines when they're needed, almost, unexpectedly in some cases. I can think of, a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago, we scaled up. We were ready to build this a big prototype. And we went from, a team of maybe 4 people to a team of 35 in a week. And we were bringing in not just product designers and engineers, but also, we had an expert in breath science who was coming in to detail some of the things for us. I mean, so having that talent ready to go without having to keep them on your payroll is a huge advantage. And that's what I see.
Any other questions from the audience? Oh, we have a comment from Brian.
I was going to say, I'll add a little bit. And I'll be honest and say that the following comment is in many ways one of the things I tell people who are thinking about working with us. We really value people that are both deep and that are broad and sort of T-shaped, if you will. And why is that? And the deep part is maybe fairly obvious. You want people who are technically expert, but I'll double down on that, and I'll say that you want people who have a firm foundation to deal with the world when things go haywire. Your foundation, your core competency is how you cope with things going wrong. You process through that knowledge base. And so each of us, I would say, has some element that is deep and well-founded. And then you need people who can link across disciplines and go an extra few feet or mile or whatever it actually is to help your coworker understand the problem that you are dealing with. And so the ability to translate problems from domain to domain in order that person A can help person B solve their problem. That's a key aspect to one of the type of folks we have. One additional point is that we are not a think tank. We're not just a set of people with, well, white hair in my case, but people who just sit around thinking and publishing. We hire all levels of folks because we can all contribute to moving some project down the road. And so even folks relatively fresh out of school actually can bring their skill level and talent, and then we can plug them into this networking effect that we have there. And they can contribute right off the bat.
Oh, we have a question here.
Yeah, I was going to say, if you've got an idea or you've got a problem, how does one start to work with TripleRing? How does that process start?
The question is, if you have an idea, how do you start? What's the starting point for working with TripleRing? How do you start? Anyone can answer that one.
Yeah, I'll give you one example. So there's a process that begins just with face-to-face, or if you can't make it out, we can talk on the phone. But there's a value in getting in front of one another and just starting to talk about what the project is, what the issues are, what you're hoping to accomplish. And there's a real opportunity for us to be very curious and very anxious to understand what you're coping with. And that is a very important process because it builds the notion that we can work as partners on this effort. And that's critical because when things are tough, you need to know the person standing beside you is standing beside you and not pushing you off the cliff. So that initial phase where we talk to one another about what the project is and what you're hoping to accomplish with it, and what you foresee as being issues that might come up, that initial set of conversations is really valuable.
Tom, you had a question?
I had a similar question as to but I'll ask my second question. What does a success story look like? How does the separation from TripleRing happen when you kick the bird out of the nest, so to speak?
Right. I guess the question is, what does success look like for TripleRing at the end? I'm not going to answer that. I'm going to let you guys answer it.
So we realize that our core competency is in the early stage and taking it through the design. We'll take it with the client. We'll take it through FDA. It's very often FDA 510K. We will build a small number of units, either for clinical trials or for marketing purposes, but we do not hold ourselves out as a contract manufacturer. We just actually, just in the last couple of weeks, we've announced a relationship with Evolve, who is a very well-respected contract manufacturer, and we respect their abilities. They're better at contract manufacturing than we might ever be because we're wired differently, and we're certainly a better development company than they would ever claim to be. And I think that synergy, Evolve is also appropriately sized. One of the things about MassDevice is that, at least certainly by consumer standards, these are very modest volumes. They also tend to be perhaps more complicated. But Evolve and TripleRing are at least appropriately sized in order to handle the kinds of clients that we have.
I think Hound also serves as a great example of a success case. We are in the, I guess, mid to late stages of moving out of the nest. We did this very, very in-depth prototyping and testing phase, got to something that works, and really TripleRing was instrumental in helping us hand that off to contract manufacturers who are now getting to the point where we're ready to ramp up and go commercial. In that phase, TripleRing's been part of the integration, so working on the team, transferring the knowledge over to the contract manufacturers, and our work at TripleRing has really shifted in many ways. Once that's wound down, we've been looking to leverage going back to some of their research and early engineering and prototyping to think what is our next steps, and a smaller effort but a continuing effort, but really because this massive effort of the breathalyzer has now shifted to its next phase, and it's really it's an advantage. There's no hesitation whatsoever. It's really been a fantastic transfer, knowledge sharing, et cetera, and very, very willing to provide everything they have to make the next step successful.
I'm going to ask one more question that I often get asked. What we've painted here, you might describe as a sort of prototypical Silicon Valley approach to solving hard problems, but does TripleRing really only work in Silicon Valley?
We most of our folks are here. We do have a Boston office, and there's one of the guys right there from our Boston office. And but we work for clients around the world. Actually, we've worked everywhere from, I guess, Japan through to Germany and everywhere in between. And I don't know which way around the earth you go, but certainly. So we can work with teams that are far, far away. And the crux of the issue there is to not rely on bumping into one another in the hallways to promote communication, but you have to institute deliberate procedural methods of communicating, because the communication needs to be no less intimate, no less complete, no less open, no matter how far away the client might be. So I think we can actually work for people around and about.
All right, I'm going to ask the last hard question. So I know we're coming to the end of our time here. The last hard question would be, you must have had, or we must have had times where we just couldn't solve the problem. We're talking about solving sometimes very technically challenging or other kinds of problems. There must have been times where we ran into a place where we didn't think we could do it. How does TripleRing react when that happens?
I'd say the first reaction is it's too soon to panic. I'll say that virtually every one of our projects at some point along its journey gets into trouble in some way, and by definition it's in a way that we hadn't expected. If we had expected it, we would have already been working on a mitigation. But we do have a very proactive approach for when you run into a problem. And I'll just talk about some of the methodology. The first is we have a lot of talented people on our team, in our consultant pool, and we will reach out to those people, and we will reach out beyond that pool. If there's anybody in the world that we can find who might be brought to bear on this particular problem, we have no problem with reaching out to them. So the first is to get help. I think the other thing is we're good at doing experiments. So, I'll just give you an example. So we develop a lot of patient monitoring equipment, and we inevitably run into the situation where the device it looks promising. We've got some things which some people would call drift, some unexplained things going on. And some people are optimistic that maybe with a few software tweaks we'll be able to get there. And I think that's a common occurrence, and you're in that zone, which is you've shown that it can work, but you're far from showing that it will work, and it will work good enough to be a reliable medical product. And so how do you figure out what the next step is? So design of experiments, deliberate data collection, extensive data collection, and then the data analysis that goes along with it. And we are disciplined to let the data speak for itself rather than arguing in terms of opinions. And I'll say that in almost all cases, there is a solution. It may not be exactly the kind of performance that we or the client would have wanted. Maybe it's degraded slightly, but it's still good enough for the product. And so these, let me just make one other point. While all this is going on, we at TripleRing are dealing with a client who we're concerned from a technical point of view. They're concerned from a life of the company point of view. And how you have those conversations, you take the problem seriously. I think that gets back to this issue of trust and respect. And I would say that inevitably, we work our way through that. I should add that there's only been one point in my career where I actually ended up proving that something would not work because we hadn't thought about the differences, and this is quite common, between what happens in the physiology of somebody who's very ill in an intensive care unit versus your normal subject matter. But only once was the evidence so compelling that you said, I've proved it won't work. By far, everything else says there is a solution. It's maybe not quite as perfect as you wanted, but we can get you there.
Yeah, and so just to cap this off, I can tell the story of the second time the THC in breath disappeared. We'd already solved this problem after 2 years of development, and it became time to come up with the next version that was going to support a low-cost design. We understood everything about the breath. We understood it needed to be a factor of 100 more sensitive. And so we built this next generation device, and big test. We brought all these research subjects in, analyzed the data, and there was nothing. Didn't work at all. This kind of process of, you thought you knew how the whole thing worked, and then it's complete and utter, you have this massive gap. The team, to what was said, immediately, it was not despair, fell back on the research. And we instigated a project once again of running about 4 or 5 simultaneous research prototypes, not expensive. These were things together. We had various names for them, the Franken system, the Hillbilly system. One of them was a clarinet mouthpiece that had been hacked together with some brass pipe to make a collector. And we fell back on this pattern of research, ran nightly tests for about 2 months. And by the end of it, we had a new theory and a new understanding of how breath actually worked, and a new design that actually is now a patented design that nobody else has come up with in the past. So it's really out of this tremendous challenge and this impossible task came fundamental new IP that actually is really supporting the future of the company.
Any final questions? I think this is it. All right, well, I'd like to thank the two of the founders of TripleRing and Jeff here for supporting this panel discussion.